What we have just heard is not a simple political explanation. It is, presumably, the verbalization of a functioning incompatible with the law in one of the most sensitive bodies for the protection of fundamental rights in Andorra. Because one thing must be clear from the very first second. The Andorran Data Protection Agency is not a parliamentary toy. It is not a discretionary extension of political groups, and it is not an organization that can be managed according to convenience, opportunity, or institutional calculation. The law establishes it as an independent authority, truly independent, with its own functions, with its own powers, and with a direction that, by law, must act without being subject to any imperative mandate or instruction. However, what do we feel in this speech? We feel that the APDA is presented as an organism dependent on the General Council. We feel that the syndics and the commission speak of tutelage. We feel that the way out of an internal crisis is not to activate the legal mechanisms of guarantee, control, and responsibility with full force, but to interview people, gather impressions, make political assessments, and from there hastily draft a legal reform. That is to say, first, the collapse is normalized, then the problem is politicized, and finally, it is intended to be resolved with a reform what, if what has been said is true, would already be a serious alteration of the existing legal order. Because here there is a first, substantive complaint. If the Deputy Ombudsman says what she says, and does so in these terms, she is assuming an institutional conception that undermines the independence of the agency. And this is very serious, because the body responsible for protecting citizens' data cannot be treated as if it were subject to material political oversight. The Parliament can legislate. The Parliament can formally appoint. The Parliament can exercise the functions that the law attributes to it. What it cannot do is convert an independent authority into an entity under de facto political supervision. The second irregularity is even more precise. The speech asserts, in fact, that those who truly appoint and designate the inspectors and the director are the parliamentary groups. No, that is not what the law states. The designation formally belongs to the General Council, and the oath before the Syndic is a formal act, not proof of an internal governing power or a political hierarchy over the agency. Presenting the groups as those who really appoint is not a simple rhetorical license. It is the confession of a partisan capture mentality. It is a way of saying, out loud, that what the law provides as an independent institution is being understood, presumably, as a piece of the power distribution. But there is more. In one of the most surprising fragments of the speech, it is stated that the director does not have direct authority over the inspectors because they are sworn positions. This statement is legally explosive, because the current regulatory framework assigned to inspectors precisely the inspections and the instructions of files that the head of the agency would assign to them, in addition to the other functions that he entrusted to them. That is to say, we are not facing an opinionated or philosophical question. If this is the level of legal understanding from which the crisis is explained, then what emerges is not a poor choice of words. It is the acknowledgement of a presumed erroneous reading, or deliberately skewed, of the legal command structure within the APDA. And here arises a devastating question. If those who appear publicly to explain the situation are unaware of, reinterpret, or distort something as basic as the functional dependence of inspectors on management, what else has been done outside the spirit and letter of the law? What is said about the Commission is also extremely serious. We are told that the Commission will interview the director and all the inspectors, that it will evaluate their contributions, and that, with these evaluations, all parliamentary groups will work together on the modification of the law. This, presented this way, is institutionally dangerous. Because one thing is to examine issues based on the subject matter, and another very different thing is to set up, de facto, an operation that is almost instructive, almost investigative, almost interventionist, but without the reinforced guarantees that the General Counsel's regulations reserve for study or inquiry commissions. And there is still one point that raises all the alarms: the duty of confidentiality. Both the head and the staff of the APDA are subject to professional secrecy regarding confidential information known in the exercise of their functions. This is not ancillary. It is nuclear. So if these parliamentary interviews were to enter into files, claims, complaints, sensitive data, or reserved information, one must immediately ask with what guarantees, with what legal framework, and under what confidentiality regime this was intended to be done. But perhaps the most devastating fragment is another, when it is admitted, with surprising naturalness, that for 2 months the agency will operate with only one inspector, and that there will be no new hires until the reform arrives. This sentence, by itself, already deserves a headline of institutional scandal, because the law does not create the APDA to decorate organizational charts or to maintain a formal appearance of control. It is created so that anyone can claim, so that the authority can endorse the admission, so that it opens preliminary investigation proceedings, so that it investigates even ex officio, and so that it protects rights. If the same official narrative assumes that the body is left practically at a minimum while waiting for a reform, then the suspicion is fierce. The functional degradation of the control authority has been accepted, presumably, instead of ensuring its effective operation. And then, there is perhaps the most revealing phrase of all: the possibility of monitoring more the director. This expression, stated as such, is devastating. Because the head of the APDA, according to the law, is not subject to instructions. She is not a general director of an ordinary department under political discipline. She is not a trusted piece of the groups. She is the head of an independent authority. This is the heart of the problem. We are not facing an innocent discourse. We are facing a narrative that, if taken seriously, reveals alleged violations of the principle of independence, a legally deficient understanding of the appointment system, a misreading of the internal competencies of the agency, a problematic instrumentalization of the Legislative Commission, an evident risk regarding the duty of confidentiality, and the public acceptance that the oversight authority could be weakened just when it was most needed. The final question is no longer whether the discourse was unfortunate. The question is much more serious. How many institutional red lines were crossed so that today we have to hear, in a public setting, an explanation that sounds less like a defense of legality and more like the normalization of a system that allegedly did exactly the opposite of what the law required?